Alright, so take one, reading through these messages. I've been feeling a deep tension between my intellect, which is being awakened by hypomania after recent depressive downtime, and instincts for pleasure, food, sex, comedy. Music is at the intersection, and my grounds for super egoic rain pulling. I'm guessing egoic is, in a Freudian sense, the middle, or super ego. I'm thinking maybe the super hyphen egoic might be like ego, the middle part of the Freudian scheme, but to a super degree. But if you mean super ego, then maybe it should have been hyphen otherwise. But I'm not sure which that means. And it's hard for me to decipher at this point what that means. But yeah, you have a tension between intellect and instincts for pleasure. So this first paragraph, like, let me try not to dig too deep, but like that first paragraph makes me think of um like this antagonistic relationship you seem to have with your body and your mind that I sort of associate with your NI versus your repressed SE. Um, I'm guessing that, you know, everything you're going through right now, like the fact that you have to seek out and pursue physical exercises purely for their own sake and not being tied to like some sort of like larger NI scope, like I'm building a relationship with this person but we're also getting physical exercise. This all feels in harmony. That you feeling more like you have to sacrifice one for another, or especially your dominant mode of doing things just to focus on quote unquote lesser tasks is would be part of the reason why it feels antagonistic to you or something that you'd rather not be doing. But, you know, it's purely a construct way of looking at something which is more, could also just be easily summed up to the fact that you're not in a situation right now that you like, and that's depressing, so very understandable. Okay, but I do feel that inasmuch as I am obsessed with the futility of civilization and of existence in general, that I am basically insane by the standard that judges sanity to be conformity to societal participation slash reproduction. This is a paradoxical standard, though, of course, we see with the movement for inclusion of those furthest from enforced reproductive norms. That's very wordy, and it's confusing for me to understand. I feel like I have to really decipher that and contemplate. I feel like that could be clearer. But I do feel that I am basically insane, according to these standards. The standards are paradoxical. The standards being how society uh, depends upon conformity and societal participation to judge sanity. Okay, so this is a paradoxical standard for society to judge sanity based on participation and reproduction. I'm guessing that sort of means society expects you to like have a family and reproduce. um, as I see for the movie. Oh, okay, okay. All right, so that seems to be correct. Just to sum it up in a clearer way, make it easier for myself to reference to right now. I'm just rephrasing this. The have a family, have a house, blah blah blah, have kids. This is normal. This is sane. This seems like a double standard because you're pointing out that society also includes or expects inclusion for people with like who are LGBT or whatever who don't necessarily fit that standard. And I'm sensing from having read and skimmed through a lot of this that there's sort of dissatisfaction with that double standard. Okay, so going on. I contemplate that LGBTQA plus movement or cultural phenomena or collective people, and it is fascinatingly paradoxical. I contemplate the LGBTQA plus movement or cultural phenomenon or collective of people, and it is fascinating. Okay, I contemplate the things, and they seem to be paradoxical, fascinatingly. Because on one hand, people want inclusion into society, by which they might enjoy equal rights and protections and access to wealth of various kinds. On the other hand, they have seen more. Did I rewrite that? A bit. On the other hand, people want inclusion into society, by which they might enjoy equal rights and protections and access to wealth of various kinds. Oh, sorry. On the other hand, they have been seen more. They have seen more than anyone. On the other hand, they, LGBTQ plus people, have seen more than anyone the tendency towards injustice in the societal system and should be suspicious of such inclusion. We don't, for example, rush to demand inclusion into the KKK simply because they're hatefully exclusionary. We demand black people be allowed into the KKK. An absurd thought, sure. Alright. Going back to this double standard, this paradox, it seems that gay people should be suspicious of that themselves because they typically see the ways in which society um, um, excludes and should therefore be suspicious of participating in it. We probably touch on this point, but right now I'm forming a counterpoint to this, thinking that when most people probably are not gonna look at this issue in abstract terms to this concept. That is, I'm experiencing these negativities. What I want is to participate and be accepted in society. That's the abstract concept, and maybe some people might say that, but like I think generally what people are tied to is the details of the details, meaning I want to be considered equally for hiring. I want to walk down the street and not feel like my other identity is a target on my back. I want to have laws that don't exclude my ability to visit my loved one in a hospital, or these specific things. For them to, like, I think for a lot of people to sit down and really consider the paradox from a purely rational standpoint, like, why is it I want to be a part of a society that has all these things that are bad, that they would have to be faced to treat their oppression as being part of a larger construct wholly, when I think most people think of things a little bit more piecemeal than that. And further to argue that I think most gay people are not gonna be I think most gay people are focused on, the small details, the little aspects to life that they see being discriminated against, and they want those individual things fixed. Well, I'm forgetting my point, so let's go on. The rhetoric of the movement is more. Oh, I remember. Okay, so gay people are probably more focused on the specific things, and in interaction with society, there's like, if you go out and in these different spheres, it's like you don't tend to get a sense of society being one actual construct so much as like being a constantly changing group of subconstructs depending on what the context is. So I don't think that, like, just out of practicality, a gay person would be thinking more about the individual like problems that they face, or individual solutions to problems that they face. And even if they are inclined to think of things in large constructs, the act of going out in reality and dealing with all these different people and different groups doesn't reinforce a sense of a single society in which we change the single society and therefore everything else is fixed. So just out of practicality, I think most gay people are not going to be concerned with this larger paradox that you're pointing out. Now, granted, for the sake of activism and politics, yeah, I think that that's where talking about things in large, monumental, like, societal scales is a tool of simplification to get people on board with that. So I suppose I can agree with the framework that you're presenting so far, if I'm thinking purely from an activism standpoint, which going ahead I think is appropriate, so let me just agree to do that. The rhetoric of the movement is more along the lines of demanding the rhetoric of the movement is more along the lines of demanding the foundation of a new society of radical inclusion and radical practical functionalism with regard to belief. I.e., one is free to believe about themselves whatever they wish, provided it doesn't hurt others and doesn't hurt themselves, and that it makes them feel better. Okay? The rhetoric of this movement is more along the lines of these big words, which is to say, one is free. The spirit of the argument: one is free to believe about themselves whatever they wish, provided it doesn't hurt others, doesn't hurt themselves, and makes them feel better. Sure. Whereas in the past, the idea of someone identifying as a catkin and so forth would be insane and grounds for social intervention. Increasingly, the feeling is, quote, if that makes you feel better, more at peace within, and as long as you're not hurting anyone, carry on. All right, sure. The conservatives rush to defend their notion of social order, though, claiming this will lead to chaos, that which society is tasked with repressing at all costs. Sure. They say, who are we, then, to repress those who, through no fault of their own, are driven by uncontrollable instincts to commit murder, rape, torture, pedophilia, etc. We must maintain exclusionary norms to keep Pandora's box sealed. And in assent, they have a point, if only in that it's not clear as we would like it to be the line that marks harm to others. And the determinism of genetics that prompt compulsions does push us toward non-punitive, potentially even non-exclusionary attitude towards harm. Alright, so you're saying there's some merit to a conservative's default stance as far as order over chaos and being suspicious of the fringes, I guess. You're saying there is some merit to that because we as a society don't necessarily have the greatest distinctions between what's harm to others, and you're comparing murder, rape, torture, pedophilia to you're comparing that to alternate perceptions that would be considered like insane in the past. I don't know, I think this is fairly weak. Like from a debate standpoint, it seems like you're making both a slippery slope argument, comparing like a genetic man identifying as a woman to being a catkin in the past. Like it's a slippery slope argument. So it's okay, there's that, and then also like I guess you're suggesting that having alternate, like, quote unquote insane views in itself is harm, but you haven't, and you're comparing it to, like, you know, things that legally we don't struggle with defining, like murder, rape, torture, pedophilia, things that we generally don't struggle to impugn from a legal standpoint. So I guess I'm not gonna go further on that because there's a lot to go through. I don't know, that just seems like you haven't really made your point, I guess, so I'll leave it at that. I'm not saying I've shot down your argument or anything. that seems weak. But again, paradoxically, the LGBTQA plus movement phenomena is associated with the cancellation, whereby people are excluded for committing immoral acts of harm, assuming they are actually guilty and not being excluded in bad faith. So the idea of radical inclusion goes hand in hand. So the idea of radical inclusion goes hand in hand at a cultural level with radical exclusion on moral grounds. And the conservatives come back defending the idea of forgiveness and tolerance and inclusion, again, paradoxically. Alright, so let me figure out this. Okay, so cancellation is a tactic, is a social tactic used by like many people, not just LGBTQA, but sure, they're used by them as well to punish immoral acts of harm, sure. And you're admitting that, or proposing that these are done in good faith, sure, which of course if they're done in bad faith it's problematic. So let's see. So the idea of radical inclusion goes hand in hand at a cultural level with radical exclusion on moral grounds. And the conservatives come back defending the idea. I guess maybe you've defined what radical inclusion is and radical exclusion is. Okay, we must maintain exclusionary norms to keep Pandora's box sealed. Alright, okay, so you're saying radical exclusion in the sense like where people are citing as a moral to be upheld radical inclusion of people who don't necessarily believe what you do, and radical exclusion is being used here as a way of identifying or marking like people who don't include others, so they are the ones that are considered radical and exclusionary. So like in this terms, like I think exclusionary could be like heretical or like on the fringes or something. Like in this sense, like this is an aside, but like inclusion versus exclusion suggests a direct opposite. But if I'm interpreting this correctly, which I don't know if I am, it seems like a different term would be better for exclusion here, because it suggests an opposite which isn't one. Like being radically inclusive is not the opposite of being on the fringes of society. And this language being used here suggests a logical opposition between those two when there isn't one. I guess to give it I'd have to give an example of that. Of radical inclusion being including people with wild views outside of your own. I guess I can see how, like, correlatively this is. Well, for instance, one can be a fringe person on society, and one can believe that the Earth is flat or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves view, like, people who don't think that as exclusionary by your terms. Like, they might be inclusive of people who believe that the Earth is round. um, so since most people since most people believe that, the Earth is round, I suppose I could say that most people believe that. That makes, by definition, the people who don't, the what you're saying, exclusionary people. What I'm saying, like, on the fringes. Um, but this is really hard to. This is hard to sort out with my ADD right now. Um, like, one can be on the fringes and not view everyone else on the fringes, I guess. Like, and there's no overall, like, we don't have, like, the advantage of a third party viewing everything and being able to decide, okay, everyone believes this and this not. It's more like statistical. Like, there's tons of disagreement that we're not, like, seeing, and it's hard to, and, like, various shades of agreement, or, like, perceptions in what something is anyway. So some of this argument depends a little bit upon a God's eye view to determine what is on the fringes, what is exclusionary, what's not. And again, I think it comes back to just, like, the society thing. Like, instead of one monumental, like, construct of a society that one tries to deal with and fix, on a practical level, we sort of live with all these differences in opinions as far as what we consider exclusionary and inclusionary, and it's not so perfect as to being able to argue what is versus, what is one thing, and then what is the disagreement to the other thing. I'm getting bogged down, and I'm probably not making any sense anyways. So cancellation, and the conservatives come back defending the idea of forgiveness and tolerance and inclusion, again, paradoxically. This seems. I think there's a non sequitur in there, I suppose. Between and conservatives come back defending the idea of forgiveness and intolerance. I guess you're commenting without having really explicitly said it, that LGBT people tend to cancel political pundit conservative talking points for being non-inclusive to LGBT people. And this seems like a double standard or some sort of paradox, because, like, because of tactics, they're excluding those voices, trying to punish them on moral grounds, which is ironic because they're trying to get inclusive. I will say, though, that is, like, if one upholds tolerance, as a societal standard, it is a mistake or just simply an error to think that, okay, well, we have to be tolerant of intolerant people. Like, and that does tend to be the argument that a lot of conservatives who have been canceled by for the reasons of like not being having inclusive speech or something, or an inclusive attitude towards LGBT people, they do tend to um, cite this as a sort of inherent flaw or something, like, oh, they're not being fair because they're arguing for tolerance and yet they're being intolerant of me and my views. And I'm like, I that's a mistake actually, because like society that a society that values tolerance has to be intolerant of intolerance. It just doesn't work otherwise. And maybe that's a paradox, but like it's not one worth. It's one. I think it's one that's just worth um, accepting the inherent paradoxes of that and moving on in practical means. This is not to say anything about like the degree of what's considered the degree of intolerance in the behavior, which remains a like you shouldn't uh, retaliate with a hammer strike to like a slap on the cheek or something like that. Like that's um, remains an issue, but that hasn't been brought up yet. Anyways, all of which in my mind signals a kind of ideological collapse whereby we do inevitably return to a state of nature or our origins, which was a condition of both radical inclusion and radical harm exclusion, or both radical freedom and profound limitations. Let me just go on. The alternative would be that I'm sensing in that last paragraph that you're illustrating what I've sort of um, proposed as a rule, a general rule. The fact that like an intolerant society needs to be intolerant of intolerance. A tolerant society needs to be intolerant of intolerance. Um, I think that last thing just sort of disagrees with that. Um, the alternative would be that instead conforming more and more efficiently to the project of civilization, whereby more and more sentient beings are protected from unnecessary harm and live the most fulfilling lives possible. But this efficiency is clearly inextricable